Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division. I'm your webcast moderator. Today, Friday, August 25th, we will be hearing Finding Common Ground when Regulating Electronic Message Centers. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, again, located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And if your question is for a particular panelist, just make sure you indicate that when you're typing your question in. Coming up on your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2017. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we ask that you reach out to them and suggest that they join us. Today's webcast is sponsored by the County Planning Division of APA, and you can learn about all the divisions by visiting planning.org/divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. They appear to be a little sparse. We promise you they will be filled in shortly. We're just getting all the information together so that we can get them approved for CM credit before we post them. So please stay tuned because we do have sessions coming up, we promise. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and then you can search for CM activities either by the event number or the title of today's webcast, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education CM credits, and you can check those out on our webcast webpage, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions and to see when we've posted everything to YouTube so that you can view recordings. And speaking of recordings, we are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel after the session. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and we'll pop up for you. We'll also have a PDF of the presentation available at the end of the webcast on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. We have two of them. First up is Mike Freeborg. Mike is the president of Clarity Forge Consulting, a firm that helps cities, counties, and industry develop and implement effective electronic regulations. Previous to this, Mike was the Director of Government Relations at Prism View Electronics, one of the world's largest outdoor LED display manufacturers. He's been active in the sign industry since 1999 and has been actively involved in electronic sign regulatory issues on a national level since 2009. In that time, he's invested over 2,000 hours working with cities and counties on the topic of digital sign regulation. In 2009, Mike developed a digital sign education program called Finding Common Ground. The program helps regulatory communities deal with the issues surrounding regulating digital signage and was approved by APA for continuing ed credits in 2009. It's been presented to over 700 planners across the U.S. and has received acclaim from planners for helping to find the balance between allowing sign owners, businesses, cities, nonprofits, a fair opportunity to use these signs while still preserving community safety and aesthetics. Our next speaker is James Carpentier, and James is currently the Director of State and Local Government Affairs with the International Sign Association. In this capacity, James works with and educates local officials and planners in the creation of reasonable and effective sign codes. Prior to that, James was the owner of Carpentier Consulting, where he specialized in sign variances, entitlements, and sign legislation. In addition, James was Director of Government Relations for one of the largest and most respected sign companies in the country. James also has over 25 years' experience as a certified planner in the public and private sectors. He has a bachelor's from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay and master's in public administration and urban planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So with that, we've got quite a lineup of folks that know about signs. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike to get us started.
Thank you so much, Christine. And just to verify, you can now see the introductory slide, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Excellent, thank you. Welcome everybody to today's webinar on finding common ground when regulating electronic message centers. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Just a brief background on how the program got started a number of years ago. Many of you can probably relate to these stories that I'm about to share. Back in 2007 in Loveland, Colorado, a planner gave us a call and said, I think I have a problem. I'm trying to form electronics regulations in our community, some new regulations, but I've held community meetings and I have the business community mad at me, I have residents mad at me, I have members of the city council upset with me, and I don't know which way to go at this moment. I could really use your help in checking out our sign code to see what recommendations you might have to make it to please the various stakeholders. So I got together with her, and this was back in an age when people actually printed things out and got literature from companies in the mail. But she had a stack of about 10 inches tall that she had been working with information from various manufacturers, codes from other communities that she had put together, and she was trying to dissect all this and formulate a code. And when I could completely understand where she was coming from, because there was no concise information that provided the template for her to follow to come together on these regulations. And I attended some additional meetings with her and saw firsthand what was going on with some of the stakeholders and how upset they were. And so I can certainly, in my mind, I just thought there has to be some education that can be offered here to everyone, the community at large, business owners, and the planning staff that could help simplify this. I mean, even business owners were demanding things that they didn't know were actually not only going to cause the community harm, but were going to cause them harm as well. So they needed some education. And another incident happened right around the same time. This is when I was in Colorado, and I was in the city of Denver, and they were holding a Board of Adjustment hearing or a planning committee hearing on a mixed-use development. And what was being proposed were some LED long strips of LED message centers that were only going to display colors or images like snowflakes or pumpkins around Halloween or things like that. There were going to be no commercial messaging on these at all, and that was declared in the proposal. Well, we show up for the hearing, and there are many, I'm seeing an unusually large number of people gathering outside, and they all have these red buttons on their lapels or on their sweaters or whatnot. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And sure enough, this topic regarding the proposed message centers for the mixed use hearing the docket came up. And keep in mind, the city of Denver at the time, and it still may have this regulation in place, only allowed one change of a message every hour. So even though these proposed displays were going to just be displaying colors and non-commercial messaging, they could only hold that color for an hour. It couldn't change to anything else in the hour, and the owners knew this and whatnot. But when it came time for public comments, one after another of the participants with the red buttons, the first person gets up and says, I'm here, I'm representing the residents of such and such, and I just want to say that I we are united in that we are opposed to these video message centers. We do not want to look like Las Vegas. This is not representative of our community. We don't want these bright video signs flashing in our rooms at night. And then another person came up and said, I am here representing such and such, another residential community group, and we also do not want these Vegas video signs, these bright video signs shining in our living rooms. And after about 10 of these people came up, that 10th person said, and everyone here that is united with me in this effort, please stand all at once and show your resolve against these Vegas video signs. And about 150 or so people stood up and turned on those red buttons, actually flashed lights. And there was this sea of flashing, blinking lights in opposition to these proposed message centers. And I just thought to myself, well, number one, kudos to the organizer of this effort, because it was the best organized effort I've ever seen in response to a proposed message center. But number two, I also thought, if I just had a message center here just demonstrating, number one, how this sign could dim at night, and number two, just what it was going to be doing for an hour before it changed to another image of, let's say, snowflakes when it was snowing, or pumpkins on Halloween, or candy canes at Christmas, or the color green in the springtime. And if I could just show them it holding constant on a color green for an hour, I just thought people might have a different opinion of what is actually being proposed and what would be allowed here. So not that it would change everybody's opinion, but I guess the moral of the story is I thought education would be really helpful on everybody's part. So that said, that is the background for how this program got started so many years ago. So again, thank you for your attendance today, and let's get started. So when working with communities since 1999, we've seen there are common questions among those that repeat themselves again and again. And these are, what are these electronic signs? How do we strike a balance between their use and community aesthetics? How do we allow them without looking like Las Vegas? Or if you're in the East, you might guess what other electronic heavy area, Times Square, we're talking about here. So how do we allow them without looking like Las Vegas or negatively impacting community safety? How do we regulate them in ways that are understandable and enforceable? And finally, what is the impact of these message centers and their regulation on users? So those are the questions that this program will address. And hopefully, through your investment of time today, you will see that there is actually a path towards creating effective electronic sign regulation in your community. So just a few key things to know before we get started. Of capabilities. They have software that controls the displays and allows the end user to follow local sign codes very easily on one condition, if and only if the sign codes are easy to understand. This is something we're going to come back to several times during our presentation today. The importance of easily understandable and enforceable regulations. Again, as an introduction to the program, it's important to acknowledge that a phenomenon called the that one sign problem is actually the basis for the majority of negative sentiment towards electronic displays in most communities that we've worked with. And by that one sign, what we mean is it's that one sign that is too bright, is too animated, is too Las Vegas, or too much of something that the community finds incongruent with its aesthetic values. So, and this can create a very, very strong opinion towards electronic displays. This can be a display that's currently in your community, could be in a neighboring community, could be in a neighboring state. These things, the emotional attachment towards this one sign, you'll hear, I don't want that one sign in our community, or you remember that one sign? Boy, I sure would hate to have that here. In Greeley, Colorado, when I first met with them a number of years ago and discussed, hey, you know, I was talking with planning staff and I said, hey, it looks like you don't really allow electronics here at all. what do you think is the basis of that? And they said, oh, we had this one sign. It was for a rental center. And boy, that thing was just blasting us with light. It was these bright bulbs, and it was just, when you drove, it just blinded you, and it was flashing all the time. And boy, we hated that. And I said, well, I've been all over Greeley. I don't know the sign that you're referencing. Where's that sign? They said, oh, that sign hasn't been around for 10 years. So it hadn't been around for 10 years, but it was still the predominant cloud overhanging the code in relation to electronic signs. It was this emotional attachment towards a sign that created a very negative experience in the community. So we certainly want to avoid that, but how do we get to a point where we can avoid that one sign in your community and have signs that are readable at night, that dim appropriately at night, such as to not create glare or distraction for drivers in the community, that are large enough and functionally readable enough so drivers driving by can see the signs? How do we create this perfect harmony of electronic signs peacefully existing in their environment? We're going to do that in today's program through two methods. One is we're going to work to dispel some of the biggest myths and concerns that have historically driven regulatory decisions around these signs. And second, we're going to take time to understand and address the 6 key regulatory distinctions regarding electronic displays, which are brightness, message hold times, transition method. This is how message comes on and off the display, transition duration, how long that transition takes to happen, the area or square footage of displays, and regulating message centers in the post Reed versus Town of Gilbert decision. So if you can handle these 6, and again, this program should get you the majority of the way there towards making sure that you address these 6 issues in your sign code regarding electronics, you will not have that one sign problem in your community. I just do not know of a single situation in all my time dealing with electronics where if a community has dealt with these 6 things, that they've ended up with that one sign in their community. So we've had exceedingly positive feedback from communities that have properly addressed these 6 issues in their code, or at least have addressed them. So with that, let's jump into some of the biggest concerns and myths that typically have guided regulatory decisions around these displays. Number 1, these signs will make our community look like Las Vegas. And if you're in the East, these signs will make our community look like Times Square. This is certainly the most prominent. The truth is there's really no comparison. We're going to take a closer look at this. On the left-hand side is a sign that was installed on the Vegas Strip about 15 years ago, which at the time was the largest sign on the Strip. Since then, there are signs much larger than this that have gone up. But this sign is 222 foot tall and has 7,000 square feet of sign area. So just as a reference for scope on this sign, this individual standing on the right here is standing on this little corner of that display. So this is a massive display. And as I mentioned, this sign is no longer even close to the largest display on the Vegas Strip. This sign, the Harmon display, when it was installed back in 2012, was the largest display on the Strip at 18,300 square feet, and it is 100% electronics. So when I ask, when we do this seminar in person, and I ask for a show of hands about how many communities actually allow electronic displays to be up to 350 square feet, which is 5% of the New York sign area, I can count on one hand the total number of responses that have said that they allow 350 square feet of electronics or larger. So it's very, very rare that a community would even come remotely close to identifying in scope with the sizes of displays in Las Vegas or Times Square. In fact, for those of you that have been to Vegas, if you actually get off the Vegas Strip and you spend a fair amount of time driving on the arterials off the Strip, you'll find that there are drastically different sign regulations that govern the size and operational methods and brightness associated with digital displays off the Strip. So the Vegas Strip and Times Square are completely unique worlds in and of themselves. So rest assured, if you follow some of the guidelines we'll introduce here shortly, you will not end up like a Las Vegas or a Times Square. Common concern number 2. The mere presence of these signs will distract drivers and cause more accidents. A lot of communities fear that these signs will create anarchy on the roads and drivers will run into each other as they get transfixed on the display, as they can't wait to see what message is next. This has not shown to actually happen in reality. In fact, studies have shown that there's no causal relationship between these signs and accident rates. There's an important distinction between distraction and danger, as in dangerous levels of distraction. Obviously, when one is driving, there's a number of things that can distract one while driving. Issues happening both in the car and outside the car. And we all know about the regulations prohibiting texting while driving or holding a cell phone while driving. There's certainly levels of distraction that are very, very dangerous. But do digital signs create a dangerous level of distraction? Several studies on several fronts have indicated no. Now, generally, traffic safety studies regarding electronic signs have come in 2 different shapes, 2 different general, I'm at a loss for the word, 2 different fronts, I guess you could say. One is measuring accident rates on a stretch of roadway, both before and after the presence of digital. So there's been a number of studies in that regard. We're going to cover a couple of those. The second major tract of trying to discern whether or not these signs create dangerous distraction is looking at the effect of signs on driver behavior, where they actually measure eye glance patterns towards and away from the roadway in the presence of digital displays. So there's been a number of studies there as well. And so we're going to take a look at these 2 fronts. First of all, traffic safety accident records. There was a study completed in 2012 called the Statistical Analysis of the Relationship Between On-Premise Digital Signage and Traffic Safety, completed by Dr. Gene Hawkins and his team. He's an associate professor and research engineer at Texas A&M University. So again, this was completed in 2012, and this study is available on the ISA's website. So, but we're just gonna highlight what the findings were on this study. Just a little background: the study examined data over a 4-year period at over 130 locations in 4 states. The key finding, we all like to just jump right to the end, huh? The key finding was we did not find a statistically significant impact. And
Mike, it looks like we lost audio on you. If you can hear us, stop talking for a second, and we'll try to figure out what's going on here. Hold tight, everybody. Okay, Mike, if you can hear me, it looks like all your settings are correct. I guess my only suggestion would be to try calling in on a telephone versus using your computer. I think you might be having some internet issues. I'm going to try typing this to you too. I don't know if James, if you want to jump in at all and keep us going.
Exactly what I was going to do. Why don't you go to the next slide and I'll pick it up, and when Mike comes back, he can continue. How's that?
Okay, Mike, if you can hear us, can you can you go to the next slide? Perfect. James, you want to go ahead and get started?
Okay. Yeah, what Mike was referring to was the VTTI study with driving performance and digital billboards back in. Okay.
Hello?
Oh, you're back.
Back. So sorry, everybody. I apologize for that. But we're back online now. So just jumping right into the Virginia Tech study. Christine, everything okay on your end before we continue?
Yeah, that was fun. I'm glad you're back.
I can think of another word for it, but we are back. So again, I apologize, everybody. The Virginia Tech Traffic Institute study. This is an institute that also did the study on that was the basis for banning cell phone use, handheld cell phone use, and texting while driving a few years back. So anyway, they did a study called Driving Performance in Digital Billboards back in 2007. Little background on the study: participants drove in an instrumented vehicle on a 50-mile loop in Cleveland. They were not informed about the true purpose of the test. There was special equipment that measured eye glance patterns towards digital billboards as well as other comparison targets, and the goal is to measure the duration of the eye glances. The key findings, again, it's important to understand that the NTSB declared, or yeah, that's a fair enough word right now. I'm sorry, my brain is a little scattered with trying to deal with the Wi-Fi issue. But the NTSB declared a number of years ago that 2 seconds, if a distraction was 2 seconds or more, it was considered to be a dangerous level of distraction from the roadway. Well, what Virginia Tech found in their study was the mean glance duration towards digital billboards was less than 1 second, both day and night. So far less than what would constitute a dangerous level of distraction. And in comparison, the study done by Virginia Tech, again, the same group here, found that texting created a mean glance duration of away from the roadway of 4.6 seconds during a 6-second period, which certainly was the basis of them recommending that that various governments ban the use of texting while driving. So clearly, texting while driving has a very different impact than does viewing digital billboards or digital signage on a roadway. So there's another study done by the Federal Highway Administration a few years back. Again, its intent also was to measure driver performance, driver behavior, eye glance patterns of digital billboards on driver safety. They took a similar approach to the Virginia Tech study. And this was released late December of 2013, so almost 4 years ago now. And their key findings were that the mean eye glance was, again, far less than 1 second, in fact, slightly less than Virginia Tech found, and the presence of changeable electronic variable message centers. Obviously, leave it to our federal government to further complicate an acronym, but changeable electronic variable message centers did not appear to be related to a decrease in looking toward the road ahead. Also, the results did not provide evidence indicating that CEVMS as that message centers as deployed and tested in the 2 selected cities were associated with unacceptably long glances away from the road. So again, that's the Federal Highway Administration indicating that driver behavior is not impacted by digital displays. So that is traffic safety, briefly summarized. Common concern number 3, if we do allow these signs, we should require long message hold times because that is the only way our community will tolerate these signs. This is a this is one of the most common things that we see. The truth is, a community's negative emotional reaction is almost always associated with improperly regulated brightness. Brief story, kind of along these lines. In Logan, Utah, where I lived for 3 years when I was with Prism View Electronics, we had a manufacturing facility actually in the town of Logan, and there was a strong movement underway in Logan to ban electronic message displays. That actually got quite a bit of steam before calmer heads prevailed and said, okay, let's get various stakeholders together and talk this out and see if we can come to a reasonable solution. When the stakeholders all gathered, I was present in the room, there were about 20 to 25 stakeholders, and we went around the room with the stakeholder members that were concerned about the use of digital displays in the community. And we said, what is concerning to you about the use of digital displays in your community? Well, the first one said, okay, it's the one sign at the Y in the road at the south part of town. It's a box on a stick and it's all electronics and it's so bright you can see it as you're driving down the roadway and it just blasts you at night and I can't stand it. Okay, thank you very much for sharing. Number two, what's concerning you about electronics? Well, it's that sign. It is that sign at the roadway, and boy, I tell you, it's so bright. I mean, you just can't see anything when you're going by that sign. It just blinds you. I just hate that sign. Thank you very much. And again, this story repeated itself. That sign, from every stakeholder that was mentioned by every single stakeholder that appeared, that bright sign. Now, at the time, there were 24 electronic displays in the city of Logan. And they were animating most of them were animating fairly aggressively. So what was interesting is the number of times that the bright sign was mentioned was 100% of the time. The number of times that the other 23 signs were mentioned was 0. This is emblematic of what you will hear from in your communities, that the vast majority of concern is regarding bright displays, not necessarily displays that are changing their messages fairly often. So just to let you know, that's usually where the negative resentment towards these displays is rooted. So if we can properly deal with brightness, you are a long ways towards addressing concerns. Okay. Regarding the use of hold time examples, to discuss hold times in your communities, just to let you know, message hold times are one of the most difficult regulatory distinctions to discuss. We strongly encourage the use of visual examples like the following to demonstrate hold times. And just to make sure I'm still connected, Christine, can you hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just want to make sure before we continue. Okay. So what I'm about to show you, just to indicate this example of hold times, what I'm about to show you is a message center holding for 30 seconds before it changes to another message. Okay, you should have seen it just change messages after 30-second hold time. What usually when I show that in person at a planning session, at about the 15-second mark, I start getting some laughs in the crowd, some snickers, some nods of the head or shaking of the head. I get a comment like, boy, that's like watching grass grow. It's certainly far from what one would indicate would be like a Las Vegas type experience with highly animating displays. So now, just to show you in comparison, this is what a message looks like with a 10-second hold time. Okay, so you should have just seen the flu shot message change after 10 seconds. And you can certainly see with static messages holding, it's not the highly animating kind of in your face kind of experience that you may have when you think about message centers, you're kind of holding that Las Vegas or Times Square experience in your mind. So certainly a very, very different experience. So in terms of using little videos or examples like this in your community, couldn't more strongly recommend it. It would save an awful lot of time. We have an easy to use website here that can get you right to these animations. So this website right here, signs.org/planners, if you click on free resources, you will see examples of 30, 10, 5, and 3-second hold times. So these are ready and easily available for your use, and we strongly encourage you to use them for internal staff discussion, planning commission meetings, council meetings, They save tons of time and agony when discussing this topic. Just a brief story about this. When back in the early 2000s, was meeting with the city of Colorado Springs regarding a proposed electronic message center for the Pikes Peak Performing Arts Center. Now, the city of Colorado Springs did not allow electronics at the time, but they were going to at least consider this for this special project or this special event center in the community. Now, when the general manager of the Arts Center, I was present in the initial discussion with planning staff, and they said, well, you know, we have a number of things that we need to tell the community about here, what shows we have, when they're happening, the times that they're happening, how they get tickets, who might be starring in the show, who the sponsors are for the show. You know, they would like some recognition. And so since we're limited on the size that we have here, we're going to need to roll through these messages fairly quickly. And city staff said, well, we really only want you to change the message once every 24 hours. That was the start of the conversation. Well, the general manager said, that's really not going to work, and a lot of discussion ensued, and then city staff said, well, maybe we can allow you to change it once an hour. And then the city manager said, please, you know, we really need to, there's a lot that we need to communicate for this to really work for us. By the end of the conversation, city staff was down to 5-minute hold times for the displays. At the Board of Adjustment hearing for this property, we actually created an animation similar to what you just saw, showing a variety of different hold times. Where they ended up for the property was a 7-second hold time, which the general manager agreed would work for them. At least they could, for typical drive time for someone by the property, they could at least show someone 2 frames of information, which can make all the difference. So we strongly encourage you to also consider other factors like allowable sign size, setbacks, etc., when discussing hold times internally. So, okay, common concern number 4, EMCs are way too bright. They will shine in people's living rooms, cause accidents, etc. The truth is, only improperly regulated or unregulated EMCs are way too bright. There are now well-established guidelines that address this issue. If you adopt these guidelines verbatim, and a lot of communities have a lot of resistance to this because they want to make these guidelines their own, but if you adopt these guidelines verbatim, you will not have dancing lights in living rooms, I can assure you. I've actually been present in living rooms within 200 feet of a digital display in downtown Denver, of a 200 square foot digital display within 200 feet of a high-end condo tower in downtown Denver. And I can assure you, I saw for myself that there were no dancing lights when the display adhered to these guidelines. So let's explore these guidelines a little bit more as we consider some of the planning and zoning considerations that we introduced before. So again, number 1 is brightness. There's, again, also message hold time, transition method, transition duration, how long the message takes to transition from one message to the next, how big the sign can be, and also the Reed versus Town of Gilbert concerns that James will discuss here shortly. So these are the 6 key things. And again, brightness is highlighted because brightness is by far the most important from a community perspective towards limiting the number of complaints you'll have regarding the digital displays. Interestingly enough, some of the other distinctions associated with transition method, message hold time, and also the size, as you might imagine, are usually most important from the business community perspective. But brightness from a regulatory perspective is easily the most important towards eliminating the that one sign issue in your community. So a little more on brightness here. How bright is too bright? Well, it's really relative. A sign that looks perfectly normal in Times Square would be a searing beacon of brightness on a dark country road. Conversely, a sign that actually exists without shedding a lot of light on surrounding property on a dark country road and looks perfectly normal, and believe me, that is possible. If it looks normal on a dark country road, if you put that same display operating at the same brightness level in Times Square, it might look like it's malfunctioning. So with that in mind, that was kind of the basis for some of the brightness regulations that you're about to see. So regulations that adjust for the ambient brightness level in where they're going to be installed. So there's generally been 2 methodologies towards brightness regulation. One that is recommended by the International Sign Association is a luminance, measuring brightness in foot candles. These meters are inexpensive. If you look on Amazon, they're between $35 and $100, and it's easy to check and enforce. The other way of measuring brightness has been luminance. This came before measuring in foot candles for message centers, interestingly enough, and it's measured in nits. Many of you on the call may have heard of that term. So it's measured in nits, otherwise known as candelas per square meter. These meters are very expensive, several $1,000s, and this can create some challenges to enforce depending on how you hold the meter, how far away you are with the meter, what you encompass in the measuring area and the device. So it can be much trickier to regulate via nits than foot candles, which is why the International Sign Association based its standards in foot candles. So a little bit more on these recommended standards. The good news is the hard work has been done. These standards were initially published in 2010 and were recently updated in 2016. So these guidelines published by the International Sign Association involve peer-reviewed research by Dr. Ian Lewin, who's a lighting expert with over 30 years experience in the industry. They've been developed solely for message centers, so please do not apply them to regular LED lit channel letters or cabinet signs. And as of now, and this number is growing rapidly, over 240 jurisdictions have adopted these guidelines in some way, shape, or form, including 8 state departments of transportation. That number was 170 this time last year. So again, that number is rapidly growing at this time. So again, these guidelines are in place and ready to go right now. Just a little more information on these guidelines. First of all, auto dimming is a must. These signs need to dim automatically. So each message center shall be equipped with technology that automatically dims the electronic message center according to ambient light conditions. That would seem to make intuitive sense, but it's important that you have it in the guidelines. And that is very common for manufacturers these days. That is pretty much a standard. So you shouldn't have to worry too much about it, but important to put in the guidelines. The primary basis for the regulations is, as the comment below, the second bullet there, the difference between the off and solid message measurements using the message center measurement criteria shall not exceed 0.3 foot candles at night. The EMC must be measured at the recommended distance based on the EMC size. So basically, you're taking a foot candle meter. You're standing a prescribed distance away from the sign based on the size of the message center. You turn the sign off, make sure the message center is off. You take a measurement at that distance using the foot candle meter. You record the reading. Then you turn the message center on, or have the message center turned on for you, obviously. And we strongly recommend all white because that's as bright as the sign will ever be, all white. Usually folks don't have that operating in all white, but you want to simulate worst case scenario. If it simulates all white and you take another measurement at that same distance with the foot candle meter, and the difference between the first measurement and the second measurement is more than 0.3 foot candles, the sign is not in compliance and needs to be dimmed further until it passes the test. That's the basis for the regulations. So just to show you a little bit more on these regulations, I'm just going to, okay, this is the document here. And again, there's a link to get to this document in the presentation, but these are the guidelines here. And I'll just scroll slowly down to what I think is kind of the key meat that gives you a little bit of background about how these guidelines were formed. And then it gives you some case studies from different cities, including Columbus, Ohio, Kitsap County in Washington, and Sparks, Nevada, about their experience with the guidelines and what they went through before and after. And this, I think, is the real meat of the language. We strongly recommend you incorporate this language within these quotes verbatim in your guidelines. It also has the area of measurement based on the square footage of the sign on the right. So as long as you can easily calculate the square footage of the message center, you know exactly how far to stand away. And there's also, you may wonder, well, how do I really take that measurement again? There's guidelines down below for your enforcement folks about how to actually handle that measurement. So it's we try to be as explicit as possible. It's really much easier than it even shows. I could do it. I've performed this test a number of times in the field, and I can assure you it's very, very easy. So you're not going to have to hire additional enforcement officials to perform this test. So that's a little background on those guidelines. And also, incidentally, while I am here and let's see, away from the presentation, I did want to show you, this is when I showed you the link earlier, it will get you to this page that is the International Sign Association page, and gives you links to all these guidelines. Here's the traffic safety information mentioned before. Here's the nighttime guidelines, executive summary of traffic safety issues, a little background in wording, some of what you're hearing in the program today. So here's the examples of EMC hold times that were mentioned before. So here's an easy way to get access to all these resources. So, okay, returning back to our regularly scheduled programming. On brightness, you may wonder, what's the effect of these brightness regulations? Well, I'm sure most everyone on the call today has experienced a sign that looks an awful lot like the one in this picture, where it's just a searing beacon of light at night, just blazingly bright. Well, these are signs that are operating usually between 30 and 100% of their maximum potential brightness at night. That's far too bright. No electronic sign should be operating at that brightness level unless perhaps they're in Times Square or the Las Vegas Strip. But those are the only scenarios I know of where it would actually look normal for a sign to be operating at that brightness level. The result of the ISA guidelines usually result in signs operating in this green area, which is between 3 and 7% of a sign's maximum potential brightness at night. Now, what you may see is that there's some environmental groups, mostly Scenic America type groups or whatnot, that usually lobby for brightness levels even lower than that. We have concerns about that because in our experience, the sign can become very difficult to read. Imagine your cell phone on its dimmest possible setting and you trying to read it in the daytime. That's essentially the effect even at night. So it can become really muddy and difficult to read, which kind of defeats the purpose in the first place. If a sign is dimming properly, a lot of times it will look actually dimmer than a sign lit by fluorescent bulbs at night. So I'm just telling you that is how the experience of how this usually shows up at night if signs are operating per these guidelines. So again, couldn't more strongly recommend adoption of the guidelines. Okay, just to again show you what this looks like in the daytime. Some jurisdictions have adopted daytime brightness regulations, and we strongly feel these are just not effective. This picture shows field testing in Pittsburgh using it was using a knit gun, which is again what the ISA regulations are not based on. But this is field testing in Pittsburgh showing a message center set at 2,500 nits in the daytime. It actually, if you put the knit gun on the yellow stone above or below where that sign is, you would find readings well in excess of 10,000 nits, which is brighter than most electronic signs can get ever in the daytime. So ambient stone is reflecting more light than a electronic sign can generate in the daytime. So it's for this reason that we just don't feel that daytime regulations really make any sense or offer any added value. They can only serve to actually harm the readability of the display, which is certainly the case in the picture that's shown here. Okay, so now on to, that's enough on brightness, at least for the moment. We'll certainly field questions later. But regulatory issue number 2, message hold time. Again, this is how long a message must remain fixed in place before it can transition to another message. This normally is in the form of seconds. I've seen as long in Denver for an hour. Loveland or Longmont, Colorado, when I left Colorado a few years back, was still at 24 hours. But most communities that actually take a strong look at this nowadays are gravitating somewhere in between 4 and 10 seconds at the moment. So, but please, it's important to understand the business impact of shorter hold times. Shorter hold times do allow businesses to cast a wider net. For instance, if we drive by a restaurant and they show a picture of a steak, I might be interested in that certainly, but my wife is a vegetarian. If while we're driving by the sign, they can show a picture of a nice mandarin orange salad perhaps, now my wife is a potential customer as well, and we might actually stop. So that's just a little intuitive example of how shorter hold times can create an increased business opportunity for the users of displays. But also, it's important to understand the impact on sequential messages. Shorter hold times allow you to communicate things with limited area about directions, event times, etc., as is shown in this example. What message do you think the black SUV driving by this sign gets from this display if message hold times are, say, a minute or 5 minutes? They know that something's happening at that time, but they have no idea really what it is. And with limited square footage to talk about what it is, and since this display, since evidently the elementary school based their purchasing decision on that sign and could only afford so many pixels in that area to convey imaging, they're reliant on the ability to change that message more frequently to communicate what's going on. So that is just a little example of how sequential messaging can be impacted by hold times. Most communities take the tract of, we need to at least allow a user to convey at least 2 frames of information to a driver by in the span that they're driving and can read the sign, driving by and can read the sign. So, when you're regulating hold times, please consider what problem you're trying to solve before regulating hold times, and just understand or be aware that retroactively regulating in this area may create legal issues. For instance, in Logan, a lot of business members had purchased relatively small message centers that were actually highly animating, but if you retroactively enforce hold times, the message centers that could on screen only display 4 or 5 words at a time could become largely useless if they can't rotate through messaging quickly, and that can make some business owners fairly unhappy, which can create some other issues. So just be aware that retroactively enforcing hold times in your community can have some impact. I have seen Sparks, Nevada, if you're looking for an example of how to, of one tract of approaching this, they did allow message centers that were smaller in nature to actually change messaging more frequently. So that is one tract of approaching this. In regards to hold times, communities again will be concerned about safety and the impact on safety of shorter hold times. Again, this has been demonstrated that safety studies have indicated that there's no causal relationship between message centers and traffic safety issues or impacting driver performance. Okay, and again, when discussing hold times, please employ the video or the examples that are shown on the ISA website that were shown earlier. Okay. Regulatory issue number 3, transition method. This is how a message transitions from one message to the next. To help provide some context for discussing this in your community, we've kind of separated this out into 4 levels. Number 1 is a static transition. So you'll see here, there's just an instant, it's like a slideshow transitioning to another display. And I know in webinars, this can lag a little bit, so hopefully you're all seeing that it's transitioning through messages it's transitioning messages instantly here. Now, level 2 involves fade or dissolve, and this is probably not going to show up well on a webinar, but I think we can all imagine what this looks like, where dissolve just kind of morphs gradually into another static image, or fades to black, and then another image appears. So this is that's level 2, and I'd say most communities that we work with gravitate towards either level 1 or 2. Level 3 transition methods are what we would call the PowerPoint level, where if you've seen PowerPoints, which you're seeing now, you can see different transition methods, sometimes between slides or within slides. This is this level where you allow more flexibility or creativity in how folks change messaging. So that's level 3. Level 4 is full motion video or constant animation, which is what you would see a lot of times in either Las Vegas, Times Square, or what a lot of communities have done outside of those areas, if they have special entertainment or pedestrian districts, they do tend to allow more flexibility in having the message change to create a sense of excitement or whatnot in that area. So that's one thing to consider, is changing what's allowed depending on the zone. Okay, so after considering, again, we have these video examples available for you on the website, but after evaluating these options, we strongly encourage you to have a discussion in your community about what works best for you. Important to make, each community needs to make their own decisions, But hopefully these visual examples will help in that discussion. And as I just introduced, keep in mind that there may be distinctions in permitted transition methods between different zoning districts. What you do downtown or a general commercial district is certainly going to vary from what you would allow near in a residential area, say for churches or schools or whatnot. So, okay, further, just a little bit more information on transition method. Please use definitions, and this is available on the ISA's website here in model code language, but use definitions when describing permitted or prohibited transition methods. The clearer you make this in your code, the happier your code enforcement folks are going to be, the happier everyone is going to be. And please be careful to revise traditional language that may conflict with the proposed EMC sign provisions. Okay, regulatory issue number 4 is duration. So how long it takes to go from one frame or effect to the next. This, it's hard to show in a webinar, but this, let's say you have this message that says come, and then another frame zooms in to, another frame comes in and says hour, big, sail, sail, sail. So that could easily fit on one frame likely, but if they use these transition methods, it can take a long time for that message to build. So we strongly recommend a consideration here to keep the transition to 1 second or less, so pretty much folks are relegated to just communicating what they want on one frame if possible. Okay, regulatory issue number 5 is the area of the sign. So some jurisdictions choose to limit the square footage of EMCs differently than static signs. In other words, what was proposed in one community we worked with recently was they were proposing let's say you are allowed 1 square footage for static signs, but paying a penalty of 20% of your square footage if you wanted a message center. So, so some areas take this tract. We do not recommend that. This is often a result of that one sign concern in the community. We recommend not treating them any different square footage wise if someone wants electronics, because they're such a powerful tool to convey what's going on. We do certainly, you should consider varying the allowable square footage based on the zoning district. So obviously in neighborhood districts, be more restrictive. In general business, perhaps less restrictive. To further this topic, some communities regulate the area of allowed message centers based on, instead of a fixed square footage, more on the percentage of allowed square footage. So say, what they want to avoid, what most communities like to avoid, is the essentially popsicle on a stick look, where 100% of the sign area is message center. So they will put different percentages in, and this just is a visual example to show you what this actually looks like. So on the left, upper left-hand corner, you have a multi-tenant sign that only allows a quarter of the area to be square footage, electronics. In the middle, 50%, on the right, 75%. And down below, interestingly enough, when the square footage area of the sign gets small, you can get to a very large percentage of the available square footage area very quickly, even with very small message centers. So something to be aware of in your regulations. What we recommend is at least 50% or more is generally needed to allow for a logo, a call to action, and imagery of the product or service that's being offered, as is shown here in this University Town Center display. When you limit available square footage for message centers to just 25% in the upper left, you're pretty much limited to just a logo display or just basic words, which, as we all know, a picture can say 1,000 words. These signs become much more powerful if they can display imagery about the product or service being offered. So just something to consider in your regulations when considering area of message centers. So now I'm sure you've all grown very, very winded, very tired of hearing me. Now, I'd like to welcome James Carpentier to discuss some other regulatory issues surrounding electronic displays.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I just want to give a quick thanks to Christine for our introductions, and also the County Division for sponsoring this webcast. Now, just a brief discussion on the concerns with regulating EMCs post Reed versus Town of Gilbert. What we suggest is content neutrality throughout the code is much more important, and we suggest too that the EMCs not have color limitations or alphanumeric limitations. And when you look at it from a broader perspective, static signs typically do not have that limitations, and it's just I think it's a little bit of risk if you start venturing down the direction of limiting the colors or in some other aspect of how the sign appears for an EMC and not for a static sign. So just stick to the good old time, place, and manner restrictions, the area, the location, the square footage, the height, and you'll be in pretty good shape when it comes to EMCs. Next, please. And Mike touched on this a little bit. Another key consideration is, where the EMCs are allowed. And the restrictions really are almost always based upon and derived from that one sign concern that Mike really talked about quite a bit. And the zoning districts making distinctions on different sizes, maybe different square footages, or operational characteristics based on the zoning district is really appropriate in relation to, if it's downtown or if it's located in an area that has a more residential character to it, that you have restrictions that fit into and match the type of the context that it's going to be in, I think is really critical. Often I see regulations that are the same across the board, and that may work okay, but I think it's really good to look at different specific regulations based upon the context and the district. And in relation to brightness and the location of residential, it can work very well to have EMCs located adjacent to residential. It's just a matter of having a reasonable offset, and with the EMC brightness guidelines that we suggest, the sign really won't be any brighter than a standard sign. In fact, it can be less than a standard static sign, so that is just not an issue. Next slide. And here's just an example where we have a EMC for a church that's located a couple hundred feet from a parcel, and or actually from a couple hundred feet from the house. It's supposed to read 200 feet from the residence and 150 feet to the parcel. And regulations that are like this have worked really well. Next slide. One of the most important things in relation to sign code update and when you're dealing with EMCs and the whole sign code itself is to really engage as many of the stakeholders as you can. And if you do that, the end results will be much better, because you don't want to go into a planning commission meeting or council hearing where you don't have those stakeholders engaged and you hear about it at one of those hearings. So the education and visualization tools are just fantastic to present at from staff level all the way up to the council or the legislative body in relation to education, because it's so much easier to talk about a lot of the different things that Mike talked about, hold time and whatnot, using those visuals. Then it's much easier to come to a consensus and what will in fact fit in your community. And also the economic studies, I think that is one thing. I know Mike is going to mention it later, but I just wanted to add that the economic studies often are not part of the discussion at any level. But I think where communities are looking to maybe not allow electronic message centers, I think they need to take into account that the economic benefit for an EMC can be substantial for that end user, and it needs to be a part of the discussion. Next slide. We find often that there's a business, or it could be a church, that maybe wants an EMC sign in a jurisdiction where they're currently not allowed. And I think if that is the case, it's always better to take a proactive approach and not have it just kind of pop up out of maybe somebody that wants them, and prepare and use the tools that we have presented. And there's other tools too that helps to educate the board and the stakeholders and everyone that's involved in the process. Next slide. Well, we've talked about this quite a bit, so really it's pretty much just making sure that you understand the issues, and I think just by listening to this webcast, you're going to have a grasp of what you need to regulate, and you can then determine, through your engagement with stakeholders, what is going to work in your community and what hold time you want, what size and what area for the EMC and the different districts is going to work. Next slide. Next slide. And I have seen it before where some jurisdictions will copy legislation from the neighboring community, and almost always when that happens, it's regulation tends to be outdated or something that's just not going to work. And there is some of the model language is available in that our ISA illumination guidelines. When you look at the definitions, we highly recommend that is appropriate, and certainly the automatic dimming and the brightness regulations. That's something we highly recommend that you copy. But everything else, I think you need to really have tailored to your community. Next, please.
Sorry, James, if you just want to mention some of the special administration options that some communities.
Oh, okay. Yeah, got it. Yeah, that's actually really important. Thanks, Mike. Prior to permit issuance, we suggest that you look at a affidavit type of document that states that the owner or the operator, the end user typically has received a copy of the requirements as far as the illumination, the hold time, and all the regulations that are pertinent to the sign, and that they will operate according to those rules. And if they don't, you will take their firstborn, or maybe just give them a notice. But I think that's a really good tool, because then at least you know that end user has received the guidelines, and it can really take away some of the enforcement issues, which is a justifiable concern with an EMC. Next slide. And as mentioned before, that the color-based and text-based regulations should really be avoided. And in addition to the Reed versus Town of Gilbert concerns, there's also some concerns with the Lanham Act, which protects trademarks for entities. And I think one thing that is often not done that I would suggest is test your regulations. And you could ask one of your local sign companies to do some drawings based upon your proposed guidelines, and most often I think that they will comply and help you out with that. And I think that will give you an idea, and you can actually look at some drawings that will depict how your regulations will actually look in your community, and you could even base that on some existing businesses in your community with some simulated images too. So that's an important thing to consider. Next. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike.
Thank you, James. Much appreciated. And yeah, we're just in our remaining few moments, we'll just cover some of the economic impacts that have been found for digital displays on various business owners. I think it's important and cities as well. So we certainly don't want this to look like a commercial for electronic displays. We just want it. We do think it's important to just educate planning community members on some of the impacts that have been seen from electronic displays at this point. So there was a study done by the University of Cincinnati titled Understanding the Economic Value of On-Premise Signs that was released in 2012. And they did one case study from that study was on Chuck Anderson Ford Mercury, and It was a car dealer outside of Kansas City. They added a message center in 2011. The goal was to increase auto sales in service work, but also enhance the dealership's reputation in the community. Their goal with the signage strategy was to spend 70% of the time on the sign advertising new car sales and service promotions, and then 30% towards civic events, so PSAs essentially. And the economic impact that they reported from the electronic display was a 30% increase in auto sales and 80% increase in service work. This is not a unique report. This is not an anomaly. There's a number of businesses that have reported similar increases, and you may say, well, how can that really be? A sign is a sign. The sign's not any bigger. Well, again, it's just rotating through imagery can convey what the business offers. So what we find is digital can be really impactful on multi-tenant retail. As we all know, retail has been hammered. A lot of your communities probably have a number of retail centers with leasing issues at the moment or vacancy issues. And these centers can help breathe a lot of life into these displays. So what you see is the exact same sign on the exact same framework on the right and the left here. What I normally ask when we're in person here is, when I'm doing an in-person session on finding common ground, is I ask participants to raise their hand when they can find Enterprise Rent-A-Car in the left-hand display. Normally that takes between 5 and 10 seconds, and some people never find it. It's about 2/3 of the way down on the left-hand side of the left-hand side. What the moral of the story is, the sign on the left is functionally invisible. It has all the tenants permanently on there, but at posted speeds, it's extremely difficult to identify tenants, if not impossible for many drivers. So the sign on the right gives brand identity to major tenants, but also allows the message center to every 8 seconds or so scroll through the other tenants, or at least change the message and display the additional tenants in the center. So gives better visibility, more functional visibility to all tenants, makes the sign easier to read. So very powerful for multi-tenant issues. So some other general issues or community at large potential benefits of electronics through increased sales, or that was demonstrated with the car dealership. Certainly they can increase sales tax revenue. They can reduce blight by making businesses more viable. I actually know of several Burger Kings in the Denver area where it made the difference between closing and remaining open. They can reduce sign clutter. As you can see here, there's no need for all those banners if you can portray what you offer on an electronic sign. They can also make unreadable signs more readable. The sign on the left was from Woodland Park, Colorado. Just imagine if you were reading that sign aloud to yourself, how long that would take. So if somebody can promote one event on one slide, another event on another slide, and the Zumba classes, if they're still offering those, on another slide. So it certainly can make the sign more digestible. So they can, again, be much more readable than static reader boards, which are allowed in most of your communities. And they can also communicate public service announcements or be a symbol of community vitality. In fact, the signs on the left are both owned by communities, the top one by the city and county of Denver, and the bottom one by the town of Parker and Parker, Colorado. And the city manager in Parker, Colorado actually reported that events promoted on their digital display actually increased attendance at those events. The attendance approximately doubled. So that was about 6 years ago. I haven't checked in with the city manager since, but that was the report after the sign first went up. So anyway, that's a brief introduction to some of what users can experience with the displays, and that does conclude our session for today. So we would certainly like to open it up for any questions you might have.
Okay, great. And there are a ton of questions, and we're not going to get through all of them. So if we don't get to your questions, feel free to just email either Mike or James. And because I'm not standing in the room with them, I can say that. Go ahead, feel free to email them any of your questions. I'm just going to kind of start at the top, and we'll just kind of work down until we hit 2:30. The first question is way back towards the beginning of the presentation. Is there a variation in driver performance across age levels, demographics, geography? And I think that'll be for you, Mike.
James, are the executive summaries listed on the traffic studies on your website, or is it just or is it the detailed studies?
I think the executive summaries are on there also, and I know there are studies that relate to that question overall, but I don't think it's geared towards electronic message centers. But clearly, there with the population demographics that are going on now, I think that the visibility and functionality of signs has a heightened importance. But I'm not aware of anything that relates to EMCs. Are you, Mike?
Well, I do know in the in both the Federal Highway Study and the Virginia Tech Study, they did address that issue, and I could be speaking out of turn here, but my recollection is that there was no indication of affected driver performance between age levels. I've heard that concern among several communities, but it's been actually about 18 months since I've read the studies in detail. So, but that was my recollection. So I'm sorry I don't have that information at firsthand. But again, if you're looking for the detail in the studies and want to confirm for yourself, feel free to email me, and I do have the detailed studies, and we can certainly get that information in your hand.
Okay. The VA Tech study found the average glance towards digital signs is 1 second. That's just the average glance time. Do you know how many of the glances were longer than the 2 second long period? As in, how many instances were drivers dangerously distracted by signs?
I don't have the exact number, but again, we have the detailed studies, and if someone wishes to email me directly, I can certainly get the information in their hands. There were individual glances that were longer than 2 seconds towards digital displays, but keep in mind, in the Virginia Tech study in particular, that one is a bit more seared into my memory than the Federal Highway Study one is. Because that was all that was available for a number of years. But in that study, they did measure eye glances not just towards digital signs, but other landmarks as well, like static signs, buildings, things like that. And there were also glances over 2 seconds towards. There was not a disproportional number of glances over 2 seconds towards digital signs as compared to the other landmarks, and that's detailed in the Virginia Tech study. So again, if somebody wants to take a look at that, the details of that, I'm happy to get that to them.
Okay. How do you define digital billboard? How does the less than 1 second glance relate to digital messages that tick across a screen, say advertising items on sale in the store, that last for several seconds?
I don't know if the root of that question is based in how do you discern what's a digital billboard versus a digital on-premise sign. James, is that your interpretation of that question, or?
I think so. Yeah. I think I think the question deals with advertising items that might not be on the premises, and I think that's pretty evident. A lot of jurisdictions choose to not allow or severely restrict off-premise types of signs, and I think we typically don't find that as an issue. If someone is going to invest the money into an EMC, they're not really interested in off-premise messages. They want to advertise what's on the site. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Mike.
I do. If the question is related to hold times associated with billboards versus on-premise signs, because in some communities they may have digital billboards that hold for a certain period of time. In most communities, it's between 4 and 10 seconds. Versus an on-premise sign, which in the community may be changing messages more frequently. I can say that just the traffic studies that were shown, where they measured accident rates before and after the studies, they were focusing solely on on-premise boards, did not increase in communities that had actively animating displays. But if it's in related to driver behavior, the driver behavior studies were done primarily regarding next to digital billboards instead of on-premise signs, and the digital billboards in those studies varied between 4 and 10 seconds. So if you're a community that's concerned about, hey, let's not allow animation because still in the back of our minds we're concerned about traffic safety from a behavioral standpoint, I can tell you that the behavioral studies done by the Federal Highway Administration and Virginia Tech both indicated that for hold times between 4 and 10 seconds, that they confirmed that the mean glance is less than a second, which did not constitute a driver performance issue in those situations. So that's my answer on that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next one is a scenario. A particular community wants electronic message centers for churches and schools, but not for other uses in a particular district. It's my understanding that you cannot separate out specific uses. Rather, you must apply the regulations to all uses within a district. Is that correct? Do you have any comments on that?
James?
This is James. Yeah, I would agree that if you are going to allow EMCs in a district of like a public use type of district for schools and or churches, that it needs to be district wide, and you cannot pick out a particular use. That would be an issue. So that's the approach that I would suggest, that it be district wide for the regulations and apply them universally for each district. But each district can vary substantially, so that's the other piece to remember. So.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Regarding brightness, are most electronic message centers lit with LEDs these days? We have experienced complaints with LEDs because they appear brighter even though they comply with our code, which regulates based on lumens.
From a manufacturing perspective, I'd say all, but I haven't been to all manufacturing plants and I haven't seen all signs, but all the signs that I have seen in that have been outdoor signs, I'd say 99.9% have been the LED, lit with LEDs. Ones that aren't generally are very difficult to read. I saw one like outdoor TV that was put up that just you couldn't read. So that's the only non-LED sign that I've seen put up. So, and what the rest of the, James, did you understand the rest of the question?
Well, it talked about the lumens approach. We'd have to know what the guidelines are to really comment on that. And it's like Mike said, if you have specific questions that we don't get to, make sure that you email Mike or myself, and we'd be happy to help you out and answer those questions, because I'm sure we're not going to get to everyone.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are there any variations in levels of distraction that is based on font size?
I can just chime in on that quickly. I think that I see some jurisdictions try to regulate font size, and that's certainly possible to do, but I would say it's a kind of a regulatory nightmare. And if I was administering that code, I would not want to be responsible for measuring font size on EMCs in my community. So I would suggest just to regulate the area, and the specific content as far as font size, leave that up to the end user. And typically it's going to work because they want to be seen anyway. So I haven't seen it be a huge issue. I know on static signs, it can be an issue too, and there's sometimes regulations will go beyond the square footage, but I would suggest that that would be the approach for EMC. Just stick to the square footage, and it's much easier to administer and to enforce.
Okay, thanks. Who funded the two studies, the Texas A&M and the Virginia Tech studies?
Mike, do you know who funded the Virginia Tech?
The Virginia Tech study was funded by the Virginia Tech study was funded by the outdoor industry. The And that was the complaints for a number of years is, hey, it's funded by the industry, so they're steering the results towards what they want to see. And I can assure you that was not the case, and it's not in their benefit to do that. But keep in mind, Virginia Tech also did the study on texting while driving that created, that was the impetus for banning texting while driving in a lot of communities. So, but in terms of who funded the Texas A&M study, I do not know specifically who has funded that. James, do you know?
Yeah, that's a Signage Research Foundation, which is a sign industry backed, but it was created, as Mike said, it's created by an engineer at Texas A&M, and I'm can assure you the industry didn't tell this professional traffic engineer what to do. So it's, but that is a good question though. Thank you for that question.
And obviously the federal highway study is funded by everyone on the call, if you're U.S. citizens.
Yeah, but one thing I just want to point out is that these studies would not occur unless they're funded by industry-backed entities. So that's at least the feeling that I have. So that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, it is 2:30, so we have to wrap up now. So again, if you haven't had any question, if your question hasn't been answered, you can feel free to reach out to Mike or James. And thank you for the two of you for again putting on a great show for us, even with a couple technical glitches. I think it went really well. So thank you, and thank you to the County Planning Division for sponsoring today's webcast. Again, if you need any information on this session, just head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and everything will be on there. Again, from the links to the recording to a PDF to recording your CM credits, all that info's on there. So thanks everybody for joining us, and until next time, have a good one.